Hello, welcome to the first episode or sort of long form video. I'm not really sure how this will go into the future. I have multiple topics that I would like to discuss today, from Labour's announcement about changes to the Office for Budget of Responsibility this week, to the wider civil service and how it behaves and how it acts, to the British political system, two-party system as a whole. And I also want to talk about the inheritance tax plan leak from Rishi Sunak and why it's just a typical Conservative policy. We can talk about wealth incentives, taxing income versus assets, and also how this relates to meritocracy. So I'm not sure how long this discussion will be, but I do want to get straight into it so we can begin talking about Labour's changes to the OBR. So the OBR, Office for Budget Responsibility, it was, just in case you don't know, it was originally set up in 2010, I believe, by George Osborne, David Cameron, to sort of trap any future Labour government in terms of their spending plans after the sort of shambles of Gordon Brown and the 2008 recession. So this is from Sky News, and it's Labour pledges more power for OBR, Office for Budget Responsibility, to prevent repeat of Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget. It says the party has vowed to strengthen the role of the Office for Budget Responsibility by giving it the power to independently publish its own impact assessments of any major tax and spending changes. By the way, if you hear any noise, I can only apologise. I seem to live on the noisiest street in London. Okay, so the proposal this week from Labour regarding the OBR that have been backed by basically every centrist in Britain circa 2015. I recall George Osborne has tweeted and called them sensible. He would. So as I explained, the OBR was introduced as a political sort of tactic to trap any future Labour government, and it turns out it might trap any future Conservative government. So these proposals, in actuality, what it boils down to is they will give the OBR effectively full independence to disagree publicly and criticise effectively with any future elected government. So Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, has stated, and I quote, that the proposals will bring stability back to Britain's economy. Well, Britain's economy is already relatively stable, and it's stably stagnant. And she also states that never will a Prime Minister or Chancellor be allowed to repeat the mistakes of the mini-budget. Now, the wording is very key here. She states, never will a Prime Minister or Chancellor be allowed. Now, elected governments should, in reality, be allowed to do whatever they want. That is democracy. If an elected government has been elected to do what they have written in their manifesto, a independent, supposedly independent government agency that is taxpayer funded should not be allowed to get in the way of that. We should not have unelected, taxpayer funded organisations like the OBR obstructing an elected government. Now, the British ruling class of both parties, by the way, Labour and the Conservatives, you can throw the Lib Dems in there as well, the Greens, you name them. The ruling class of both major parties don't want the people of Britain to actually make decisions anymore. Hence, sort of this proposal is to give more power to supposedly independent bodies. And it's also why you hear them, all the time now. I hear it all the time in every interview. If a politician is asked about a potential referendum on an issue and they say, we've had enough of referendums, we've had enough, one referendum was enough, or, 2016 has proved that, Britain doesn't want more referendums. Well, actually, I haven't had enough of referendums. In fact, I don't think the people have had enough of referendums, as it seems to be one of the only ways that we can actually have any type of debate or discussion or change in this country. If it wasn't for the referendum result in 2016 and the subsequent Brexit Party EU result in 2019, we would not have left the European Union. It was only the fact that 17.4 million people voted to leave the EU, that change actually happened. Now, this sort of independent, bureaucratic, unelected sort of way of running things will only be strengthened by the Labour Party. It will be strengthened and solidified, even more so than it has under the Conservative Party, and they have done a very good job of attempting to do that. It's why, for example, the Labour Party have hired Sue Gray, who was, if you remember, the former permanent secretary for the Cabinet Office, and she investigated Boris Johnson over the alleged parties in Downing Street, hence why her appointment to become Chief of Staff for Keir Starmer was so controversial. That, and also the fact that she is supposedly an impartial civil servant. So not only are the Labour Party or have hired Sue Gray, they are also, according to a Guardian report this week or this weekend, the party are continuing to hire even more civil servants. So the Guardian have wrote, Labour on a hiring spree across Whitehall in preparation for government. More than a dozen civil servants from different departments have moved to the party in the past 18 months. Now, what this means is the civil service and unelected organisations will control Britain. They will hold the real power. They will be the real power brokers. Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Angela Rayner, they are just sort of media figureheads, if you will. The people who will truly be making the decisions are unelected. Now, elected politicians will have, through this sort of organization of the state, will have even less power than they have now, and they will love it because it means less responsibility, less accountability, less to do. It means they don't really have to do their job. They sort of just sign off and stamp things off. So what you have in Britain in a few years' time, or even now to an extent, is you have, or you will have, the OBR setting fiscal policy. So, for example, any future chancellor could come out and say, I'm sorry, we can't cut income tax like we promised in our manifesto because the OBR have said no. So you have the OBR setting fiscal policy. You have the Bank of England already controlling monetary policy, which is why it was sort of so laughable when Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt and the Conservatives were saying, we're doing all we can to get down inflation. Well, they weren't doing anything because the organisation that could do something to curb inflation is the Bank of England, and it is independent from the central government. So they have no power over sort of monetary policy in effect. So you have the OBR setting fiscal policy, the Bank of England setting monetary policy, and then you have judges and unelected organisations, taxpayer-funded organisations that control almost everything else, and the civil service as well. So that is, whether that's immigration, housing, even constitutional matters, the civil service and unelected organisations hold the power. So another example is the civil service recommends appointees to run these unelected, taxpayer-funded government organisations. Andrew Bailey was he ran the Financial Conduct Authority. He is now, of course, at the Bank of England. So when he fails, as he did fail at the Financial Conduct Authority, and when he has failed at the Bank of England, or he just isn't very good at his job, is he sacked? Are the people who recommended him to be appointed, are they sacked? If a manager in a private company kept promoting or hiring incompetent people, would he be kept in his job? Would that company continue to employ that manager? Or would they say, actually, you are making bad decisions, it is time for you to go? They, of course, if it was, a well-run business, a profitable business, they would, of course, say, actually, you are making bad decisions, it is time for you to go. We don't have that. The British ruling class, they don't really believe in real politics. They believe in impartial, unbiased, sort of independence. Well, we of course know that there is no such thing. And to pretend there is incredibly disingenuous, and it is undemocratic. It's disingenuous and undemocratic. And this system that we have now, this predicament that we have now, can, in my opinion, only be solved by political appointees. So if the current civil service are pretending to be impartial when we all know they aren't, the next course of action is to hire people who are upfront about their impartiality, as is the case in America. For example, Trump. So the president, so for example, when Trump came into office in 2016, there are thousands of federal positions that the president has the power to recommend people to run and to occupy these positions. So what the president does of both parties is he sacks or removes the previous political appointees and appoints his own. So he appoints people who are sympathetic and support his agenda. This is what we should be doing. And I would just like to highlight another story that I think was out this week. Yes, this week. And it was picked up by a bunch of media outlets, but I'm reading it from the Times. And the title is, "Officials Wanted Queen to Question Boris Johnson's Pandemic Conduct. The behaviour of the former Prime Minister was the subject of secret phone calls to the palace. The officials reportedly hoped Queen Elizabeth would raise her concerns with Johnson during their private weekly audiences. One source claimed Johnson had to be reminded of the Constitution. Had to be reminded of the Constitution by unelected civil servants and by an unelected head of state." Now, this was from a BBC documentary by Laura Kuenssberg, and the civil servant in question is a woman named Helen McNamara, who was the former Deputy Cabinet Secretary. And she actually said, if you watch the documentary, that she couldn't talk about conversations with the palace as she would, quote, get in trouble. So perhaps we can infer that even the royals and people in the palace were involving themselves in the affairs of the elected government. So we have the civil service involving themselves, and we also have the palace as well. Isn't Britain very democratic? Now, why do our politicians not believe or act from a position of real politics? That is, having a real political agenda, a real political vision, and driving it forward, having political goals that you want to see come to fruition. Well, it's partly because it is too difficult for them. They are not intelligent people. They are not competent people. They'd much rather prefer having the status, the media appearances, and the titles, and then the cushy jobs after they leave, than they would actually doing the job and, potentially becoming unpopular on the London dinner circle. But it's also because they have very little organic support. And these people know that they are very, very insecure. Politicians are naturally insecure. That's why they go into politics. So, for example, take the last Conservative leadership election. Now, about 170,000 people voted to elect the previous Conservative leader. So that was between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. So 170,000 people voted in that election. So there are, we can assume, around that number of members of the Conservative Party. So 170,000 is about, and I worked it out, is about 0.368% of Britain's total registered voters. That is nothing. In contrast, in the US presidential primaries in 2016, more than 58 million people voted Democrat, Republican in those primaries, and that equates to about 28.5% of estimated eligible voters who cast their ballot to elect their party's leader, whether that is Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. Now, of course, this isn't an apples to apples comparison, but you see the point that I am making. Britain's political parties have almost no organic support. They have no true organic sort of network of people in the country. Hence why they rely on massive donors, and more specifically in recent years, foreign donors. So this was in the Times this weekend. I'll read it out to you. The Conservative Party raised more than £12 million in their first 3 months of this year, receiving their biggest donation in 20 years from the billionaire businessman Mohammed Mansour, I think his name is, the Egyptian-born business tycoon who was appointed Tory treasurer by the Prime Minister last year, gave the party £5 million. The Conservatives received 2 more big donations, both valued at £2 million, including one from an Amit Lohia, I think it is, who is a wealthy Indian industrialist. Our decrepit, two-party, corrupt political system is propped up by rich billionaire foreigners who are buying clout and status from the Conservative Party, the ruling party. They are buying influence, buying a seat at the table, buying a position on the London political scene, whilst the unions prop up the Labour Party with their own members' fees. It absolutely should not be allowed. But you will never hear any politician, even people in the media, you will never hear them saying this is wrong in Britain. They genuinely believe that there is nothing wrong with a political party, a British political party, being resurrected every few years by a foreign billionaire who is looking to join the London political social scene. These people deserve absolutely no respect. No respect. It's not right, and any serious political movement must make banning the donations from foreign billionaires, from foreigners, period, they must make banning this a top priority. Even today, the media have run a story about a rare British billionaire who is a major political donor. So this is a story. Major Tory donor threatens to back Labour over madness of Sunak's net zero U-turn. Billionaire John Caldwell was the Tories' largest donor before the last election in 2019. Now, net zero is clearly a priority for Mr. Caldwell because he is a billionaire. So of course it would be. It's the fashionable cause of the global ruling class. Now, ignore any poll that tells you it is a top concern or top issue for anyone else in the country. It's not. If you speak to normal people, they will not mention net zero as being anywhere near their top concern. The ruling class's priorities are not the people's priorities. The things that normal people care about, the likes of John and Rishi Sunak, don't care about. How many Britons do you think are okay with more than 1 million immigrants, legal and illegal, coming to Britain each year? What percentage? It'll be something like 0. It'll be something like 0. Are the political class doing anything meaningful to stop that? Of course not, of course. And that leads me on to my next point, which is that why do you never see any party political campaigning materials? Why do you never see any, children with Conservative posters up in their bedrooms, or, Labour posters or Labour leaflets or anything? America has the Trump hats and the, I'm with her, t-shirts and, political merchandise. There is nothing like that in Britain. College students have the, Trump 2016 Make America Great Again flag. We don't have that in Britain because our parties do not have any genuine organic support. If you want further proof of this, we can, prove that Britain's political system has basically 0 organic support. You can look at this poll, which is that almost 2/3 of people believe that Britain is headed in the wrong direction. That is the only poll that matters. Ignore all others. The British people are not getting anything they want. They barely got the 2016 referendum result. They aren't getting higher wages. They aren't getting cheaper and bigger housing. They aren't getting cheaper energy. They aren't getting lower immigration. They aren't getting a justice system that is tough on crime. They aren't getting functioning, effective public services. This system, it isn't functioning for the majority of people, and it will come crashing down. They always do, and it is just a matter of time. Now, moving on to inheritance tax. So this story, I think it leaked in the Times, but I'm reading it from the Times at least anyway. So it is Rishi Sunak draws up plans to slash inheritance tax, targeting, quote, the most hated tax in Britain is just one of the crowd-pleasing policy changes in the mix for the Conservative conference. Now, 3.76% of British deaths result in an inheritance tax charge. That should be clear from the start. I don't think that that is widely known. And before I sort of get to what I have to say, I would like to read a quote from a brilliant man called John Hoskins, who was a former policy advisor to Margaret Thatcher in the early 80s. So he writes this in the Times in 1983. For 30 years after the war, despite having an aging population, we contrived to suppress any latent dynamism in the country by leaving inheritance virtually untaxed while making saving almost impossible. It was as if we wanted to prevent a new rich class from disturbing either the peace of mind of the old rich or our national preparation for a future of genteel poverty. Now, absorb that, keep that in mind, and I'd also like to read a section from a piece I wrote about sort of past captains of industry, past sort of British captains of industry. All these men created wealth. They were not idle, they built. This is something Britain's current idle aristocracy does not have. Take a look at the recent Sunday Times rich list. Ignoring the fact that the richest British citizen is an Indian immigrant, few on the list of 350 create, manufacture, or engineer things. The predominant categories are property, finance, inheritance, and even they are dominated by people who weren't born in Britain. Britain's ruling aristocracy consists of a parasitic landowning class, an ungrateful and shameless nepotistic class who catapult themselves into positions of power whilst lacking intelligence, and finally a foreign ownership class that picks apart British business and often starves them of investment. This is Britain's social hierarchy, with no vested interest in the nation, only concerned with retaining their own wealth, power, and influence. Is it any wonder our country is declining when you have a ruling class that doesn't care? What do you expect? What is clear is that inheritance tax, in a true meritocracy, inheritance tax is very plainly unjust. It is unjust to give your offspring a major unearned advantage. It entrenches mediocrity, it entrenches nepotism, and it entrenches idleness. We should absolutely be incentivizing people to build their own and to make their own, rather than wait for a relative to die to obtain wealth. That is not a productive use of an individual's time. It is especially not a productive use of a young person's time, especially when they don't know when that wealth will come. It could be tomorrow, it could be 3 decades away, 4 decades away, 5 decades away. We don't know. Now, nobody is harmed through inheritance tax. It is paid from the wealth of someone who is dead, and that wealth is not owed to anyone else because it is unearned. Inheritance tax should encompass far more people, and taxes on income should be far lower. Taxing assets at death is astronomically more fairer than taxing productive income whilst living. For example, the current marginal tax rates can exceed, in some cases, 70%. It is, as Hoskins says, the quote that I just read out before, entrenching an old rich class and stifling any new rich from succeeding. And to talk about incentives in terms of building wealth to pass on to your children, but then in the same breath to ignore and stifle the incentives for young people to create their own wealth in the first place, is the fault of misplaced priorities by the Conservatives. And we shouldn't be surprised. That is their sort of classic view. Most people do not have the focus or luxury to be able to think about passing on wealth when they die. It is a rich person's luxury to be able to do that. Now, this goes on to, meritocracy as a whole. If you have a system that allows generations to pass along wealth, whilst also stifling those individuals who are attempting to create new wealth, you are not living in a meritocratic system. You often hear the argument from primarily conservatives that the children of rich parents would be rich anyway without that inheritance. Well, all I would say, if that is the case, why object to inheritance tax? If you are so confident that these people would be rich anyway, let them start from a similar position as everyone else. If that is true, then they will be successful through merit. You know, I'll ask the question, would people like King Charles and his offspring, Harry and William, be successful if they weren't born into excessive wealth and royalty? Would the inbred, low IQ British aristocracy still have influence and power if not for their hereditary wealth and land? Now, I know my answer. I think I can guess other people's answers as well. But tax on inheritance is the fairest way to build a country that champions merit, intelligence, hard work, entrepreneurship, and it is the fairest way to ensure that Britain does not have a generational, entrenched class of people with power only because they are wealthy. If we believe that wealth does indeed buy true power, we cannot allow that power to fall into the hands of unsuitable people. This is a typical conservative policy that some commentators are attempting to spin as pro-family. Those commentators should not be listened to. What this policy is, in fact, is pro-assets, pro-pensioners, and pro-generational wealth. It doesn't help working people, it doesn't help families, it doesn't help young people. Who it will help is the children of our esteemed MPs, who almost all will reach the inheritance tax threshold. So that is, of course, incredibly convenient. I think we will end here. I hope that this has been interesting and enjoyable to listen to.